Alrighty, want to record for podcast 22 since it looks like I'm going to get the time to do so. So I'm going to go through some of this material. This is going to be a more limited podcast, I guess, in terms of the scope of the material I'm going over, especially compared to the last one and maybe the last two as far as when I'm even putting these episodes out, because I've just been putting them out sporadically as I go, not on sort of a scheduled anything. So that being the case, we're continuing with Socrates' apology, Plato's apology, and in particular we finished his defense, and he's turned the case over to his jurors and the ball's in their court, etc. And then we got a little coda. So I was going to do for this pod 22 Socrates after conviction with a question. Does Socrates deliberately provoke the jury to condemn him, or is that just a part of the irony of it all? So again, we've been discussing the theme of Socratic irony, and so we're gonna examine what he says here and see what it says about him, his character, etc. So Socrates says here, there are many reasons, men of Athens, why I'm not resentful at this outcome, that you voted to convict me, and this outcome wasn't necessarily unexpected by me. I'm much more surprised at the number of votes cast on each side. I didn't think that the decision would be made by so few votes, but by a great many. Yet now, it seems that if a mere 30 votes had been cast differently, I'd have been acquitted, or rather it seems to me that where Miletus is concerned, I've been acquitted even as things stand. Not merely acquitted, on the contrary, one thing at least is clear to everyone. If Anytus had not come forward with Lycon to accuse me, Miletus would have been fined 1,000 drachmas, since he wouldn't have received a fifth of the votes. It's a bit of technical jargoning there by Socrates, where he's pointing out that the margin for conviction was relatively thin. Again, I think this is like a 500-person jury, so a mere 30 votes differently would have made the difference. You talk about a modern jury of any kind, you're not talking about a 30-person difference. But then again, this is why you've got to look at it in the context of Athenian democracy, Athenian jury trial, etc. So he knows he's been convicted, but he's pointing out the charges against him on the basis of his thin conviction is apparently just essentially the charges are thin, the conviction is kind of a momentary spasm of injustice coming from the Athenian polity, and like he said, they're gonna regret it, and etc. But he says he's not resentful of the outcome. So in line with what he said earlier, he's not overly concerned with being put to death. He says the outcome wasn't unexpected by me. So again, that's why people will question whether or not he sort of deliberately provoked this outcome for whatever reason. He was old, he's sick of it, whatever you want to sort of throw out there as reasons for why he may have done what he did. But whatever the reason is for what he did, he was certainly aware of what he was going into. And so he basically points out kind of like how the Athenians had put on trial a number of generals all at once in a way that was procedurally unlawful. He's basically pointing out if you hadn't done the combination factor of all these charges together, you idiots wouldn't have even gotten, essentially Miletus on his own would have been fined 1,000 drachmas, etc. You wouldn't have received a fifth of the votes, which again I think is literally 1 out of 100 out of the 500 in the jury. So, be that as it may, the man demands a death penalty for me. What then? What counter penalty shall I propose to you, men of Athens, or is it clear that it's whatever I deserve? What then should it be? What do I deserve to suffer or pay just because I didn't mind my own business throughout my life? Because I didn't care about the things most people care about, making money, managing an estate, or being a general, a popular leader, holding some other political office, or joining the cabals and factions that come to exist in a city, but thought myself too honest in truth to engage in these things and survive. Because I didn't engage in things if engaging in them was going to benefit neither you nor myself, but instead went to each of you privately and tried to perform what I claim is the greatest benefaction. That's what I did. I tried to persuade each of you to care first not about any of his possessions, but about himself and how he'll become best and wisest, and not primarily about the city's possessions, but about the city itself, and to care about all other things in the same way. What then do I deserve to suffer for being such a man? Something, good men of Athens, if I am indeed to propose a penalty that I truly deserve, yes, and the sort of good thing, too, that would be appropriate for me. What, then, is appropriate for a poor man who is a public benefactor and needs to have the leisure to exhort you? Nothing could be more appropriate, men of Athens, than for such a man to be given free meals in the Prytaneum, much more so for him, at any rate, than any one of you who has won a victory at Olympia, whether with a single horse, or with a pair, or a team of 4. You see, he makes you think you're happy, whereas I make you actually happy. Besides, he doesn't need to be sustained in that way, but I do need it. If justice demands, I must propose a penalty I deserve. That's the penalty I propose: free meals in the Prytaneum. Note here, the Prytaneum, building on the northeast slope of the Acropolis, is the symbolic center of Athens where the communal hearth was housed. So, this here is where you can say Socrates is making, no doubt, one of his ironic and Socratic irony sort of statements, but also you can argue he's making a deliberately provocative statement here for the purpose of provoking people to put him to death by saying, one of the things you can say in counter to that is just, look what he's saying. I didn't mind my own business. I told people to care about their virtue instead of possessions, essentially. And he says to care about becoming best and wisest, not primarily city's possessions, city itself, all other things in the same way. So to propose a penalty for this, arguably you can say, well, he's viewing it as, let's be honest, like I'm doing you guys a service, so I deserve to be compensated for it, and not by the supposed students of mine, but by the society, more generally speaking. So he proposes his penalty, and then says, now perhaps when I say this, you may think I'm speaking in quite a willful manner, just as when I talked about appeals to pity and supplications. That's not so, men of Athens. Rather, something like this. I'm convinced that I never intentionally do injustice to any man, but I can't get you to share my conviction because we've talked together a short time. I say this because if you had a law, as other men in fact do, not to try a capital charge in a single day but over several, I think you'd be convinced. But as things stand, it isn't easy to clear myself of huge slanders in a short time. Since I'm not convinced that I've done injustice to no one, however, I'm certainly not likely to do myself injustice to announce that I deserve something bad and to propose a penalty of that sort for myself. Why should I do that? In order not to suffer what Meletus proposes as a penalty for me when I say that I don't know whether it's a good or bad thing? As an alternative to that, am I then to choose one of the things I know very well to be bad and propose it? Imprisonment, for example. And why should I live in prison, enslaved to the regularly appointed officers, the 11? All right, a fine with imprisonment until I pay. But in my case, the effect would be precisely the one I just now described, since I haven't the means to pay. Well then, should I propose exile? Perhaps that's what you'd propose for me. But I'd certainly have to have an excessive love of life, men of Athens, to be so irrational as to do that. I see that you, my fellow citizens, were unable to tolerate my discourses and discussions, but came to find them so burdensome and odious that you're now seeking to get rid of them. Is it likely, then, that I'll infer that others will find them easy to bear? Far from it, men of Athens. It would be a fine life for me, indeed, a man of my age, to go into exile and spend his life exchanging one city for another, because he's always being expelled. You see, I well know that wherever I go, the young will hear me speaking just as they do here, and if I drive them away, they will persuade their elders to expel me, whereas if I don't drive them away, their fathers and relatives will expel me because of these same young people. Now, perhaps someone may say, but by keeping quiet and minding your own business, Socrates, wouldn't it be possible for you to live in exile for us? This is the very hardest point on which to convince some of you. You see, if I say that to do that would be to disobey the God, and that this is why I can't mind my own business, you won't believe me, since you'll believe, or you'll suppose I'm being ironical. But again, I say it's the greatest good for a man to discuss virtue every day, and the other things you've heard me discussing and examining myself and others about on the grounds that the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. You'll believe me even less when I say that. I stumbled over my words, so let's repeat that sentence because it's one of the great quotes in philosophy. After he says, you'll suppose I'm being ironical, but again I say it's the greatest good for a man to discuss virtue every day, and the other things you've heard me discussing, examining myself and others about, on the grounds that the unexamined life isn't worth living for a human being. You'll believe me even less when I say that. But in fact, things are just as I claim them to be, men of Athens, though it isn't easy to convince you of them. At the same time, I'm not accustomed to thinking that I deserve anything bad. If I had the means, I'd have proposed a fine of as much as I could afford to pay, since that would have done me no harm at all. But as things stand, I don't have them. Unless you want me to propose as much as I am able to pay, perhaps I could pay you about a mina of silver, so I propose a fine of that amount. One moment, men of Athens. Plato here, and Crito, and Critobulus, and Apollodorus as well, are urging me to propose 30 minas and saying that they themselves will guarantee it. I propose a fine of that amount, therefore, and these men will be sufficient guarantors to you of the silver. So, this note here says 30 minas, which is 30,000 silver drachmas, was almost 10 years' salary for someone engaged in public works. So, clearly a large hunk of change that Socrates whatever you want to say. He mentions himself being ironical. I'll go over bits of this again, but really gonna chew on these because there's only, after this, 3.5 pages left, so we'll kind of do that all in one session. We'll leave this as a shorter sort of episode here of Page of Plato. But so there's sort of a number of things going on. Like I said, he's eventually proposed a big fine of silver because the 30 mina. So if it's 10 years salary for somebody engaged in public works, then 3 mina is a year's salary. So Socrates proposed a fine of a mina, so that's a third of a year's salary. So that's still a huge chunk of change, I would assume, for Socrates. And then, so that's something where he's, whatever you want to say about the proposals that he's made, I don't think you can say that he's done so much that they should really vote to put him to death. It's a little extreme because, again, he's proposed a fine. Whether or not he was joking, he has sort of asserted his opinion. He doesn't think that the money being taken is a real loss, so he's fine with that. In a way that he's not as concerned with that as he's interested in an issue like people's lack of knowledge about what happens when they die, etc. Then to go over some other things. So, he's not resentful of the outcome that they voted to convict him. Conviction vote was narrow, and then he basically says at the beginning, he's like, I basically was acquitted by the fact that you didn't vote more convincingly against me. And then he says, that person demands the death penalty. What counter penalty should I propose to you? And this is where you can say he's, doing the most to provoke the jury. But again, he's pointing out, he's like, the worst thing that I am, essentially, according to you people, is I'm sort of a nuisance in public. Again, he sort of pointed to the fact that the proper and appropriate sort of response to this sort of behavior would essentially be private admonishment and correction via education, not punitive punishment. So clearly the Athenians are not doing the right things here, and this is kind of implied by what Socrates says in terms of, I'm too honest to engage in politics and survive. I tried to persuade each of you not to care about your possessions, but about yourself, becoming best and wisest, not about possessions, but the city itself, all other things in the same way. So these are the things that he cares about, and I think he's saying everybody claims that they care about these things. The difference is that I do care. I can demonstrate I care. I can demonstrate when other people don't care. And so that's just something to keep in mind as he says that. It's probably part of his also the sort of Platonic argument, all societies are corrupt, etc. But again, when he's proposing a penalty for what he deserves to suffer for being somebody engaged in philosophy, he basically points out, he's like, in a certain sense, you should just feed me for the rest of my life since I'm so poor. That would be really helpful. I need that more than the Olympic athletes do. And then other interesting things, sort of the moment of self-reflection when he says, perhaps when I say this, you may think I'm speaking in quite a willful manner. So, he, like, arguably any good wise ass is well aware when his audience is starting to get on to what he's doing. And he basically points out, though, he's like, you all would be crying and bringing in your children, your wives, and all this silly shit. And the difference between me and them is I'm actually convinced I've never done anything wrong. So just because we've been together for a short time, I'm not able to convince you. But if I have multiple days, and he says if we had a law, as other people do, not to try a capital charge in a single day, but over several, I think you'd be convinced. So Socrates is making sort of a due process sort of argument where he's like, our system doesn't allow for the sort of due process that's necessary for the true implementation of justice. And so he says, since I'm convinced I've done injustice to no one, I'm certainly not likely to do myself an injustice to announce that I deserve something bad and to propose a penalty of that sort for myself. Why should I do that? So, I don't need to say anything else. He's saying it all right there. And he also, he points out, he talks about imprisonment. He says, basically, I think he implies that being imprisoned would be bad. Because he says one of the things I know very well to be bad and propose it. So imprisonment's the first one that he says, and then exile. And he says I'd have to have an excessive love of life to be so irrational. So here's this sort of excessive love of life being irrational sort of idea. And he points out, he's like, if you exile me, how do you suppose I'm going to survive when basically my native fellow citizens couldn't stand living around me? How am I going to survive all out there? And he says, by keeping quiet and minding your business, Socrates, wouldn't it be possible for you to live in exile for us? That's the hardest point on which to convince some of you. You see, if I say that would be to disobey the God, this is why I can't mind my own business, you won't believe me. And he says himself, you'll believe or suppose I'm being ironical. Since you'll suppose I'm being ironical. So here is Socrates, deliberately tipping the cap to the irony side of the possibilities, and but again, to say that Socrates is not being ironic here is a relatively simple argument to make, and the argument is made by virtue of the fact that Socrates then says it's the greatest good to discuss virtue every day. Unexamined life isn't worth living for a human being. Basically, we need to discuss virtue every day, and virtue ultimately coming from wisdom and knowledge. The unexamined life, therefore, is not worth living for distinctly human beings, especially somebody like a Socrates. So, and he also points out, he's like, if you're technically in trouble for something and you don't feel you've done anything wrong, and somebody tells you, it's like, well, just propose some slap on the wrist and you'll get away with it. That person trying to whisper in your ear fundamentally doesn't understand principles of justice and rightness clearly, because, they don't care about the truth. They have no adherence to wisdom, etc., etc., etc. But again, this is just to go over this material quickly to discuss the fact that, this is what provoked them to sentence him to death. So primarily it's the meals at the Prytaneum comment, where they're kind of like, you want meals at the what? Why do you want that? What makes you feel like you're entitled to that? What makes you feel like you have the right to ask for that in this circumstance? If you're his attorney, you might tell Socrates, hey, this is not going to help you win your case. But again, Socrates would probably, if he had a state-assigned attorney or something, would probably have so much contempt for them that person would probably, resign pretty quickly as far as representing him. And, again, who knows if he's really interested in representing himself to acquit himself, whether he's trying to defend his reputation and nothing more, etc. There's a lot to go over, but I just wanted to go through that section and sort of isolate it, because it's really only it's 2.5 pages, so, but 2.5 really important pages, and we could dive in more to Socrates' sort of opinions on wealth, and the fact that he clearly designates that wealth is something he's basically willing to part with, even on behalf of other people whose wealth he's basically volunteering for his services. Funny though that seems, but that's not as important, because we'll get into that more if I get to sort of the Republic and things like that. But for now, I just wanted to do this quickly. So next time on Page of Plato, do the last 1, 2, 3.5-ish pages of Plato's Apology, where Socrates at 38c, he begins to discuss, essentially, he makes certain prophecies, and we'll want to go through that, but for now, next time we'll hear him essentially talking to the jury after they voted to execute them. And I guess our question will be, does Socrates have a change in tone from the previous section to this one? I'm trying to do this almost as if I was teaching my course, and I mean, you'd never teach a course, I don't think, going this slowly through Plato, unless this was the only thing you were doing all semester. But just real quick to wrap this up. So again, the question for pod 23, what I'll be discussing is essentially from 38c, does Socrates have a change in his tone from the previous section? So is there a change in tone from the sort of joking manner of him allegedly provoking the jury to then what he maybe says, taking the irony mask off, when he gets more serious, starts making his pronouncements, his prophecies, etc. But we'll go over that next time. But just real quick, as a capper for pod 22, the question we were going over, does Socrates deliberately provoke the jury to condemn him, or is that part of the irony bit of it all? Again, I think it's part of the irony thing. I think the irony bit is holistic to consider. We're going through a lot of material, so you're seeing lots of different examples of the irony, and this is sort of the best way to analyze it, because I think you have to sort of see it for yourself and start to judge and say, essentially, do you take him for being more, sarcastic, ironic? Do you take him to be more genuine? Does your placement on that sort of spectrum, does that say more about you? Does it say more about your in-depth understanding of the text, etc., etc.? That's more difficult to say, but as far as sort of providing an opinion, my opinion, if you're asking if he deliberately provoked them to kill him, I'd say no. I say he's well aware that that's a possibility, but that it's not his goal. His goal is essentially simpler. Like he said, he's doing his philosophy bit. He's really fulfilling his mission to Apollo with all of this. And so on that basis, I don't think he's deliberately provoking them to put him to death. He just doesn't believe that's a bad thing, and so it's part of the irony of it all, and that's my story. All right, thanks.